concern was allowed to. Martha Washington was unhappy, and everyone knew it, including her frightened slave. The president's nephew, Robert Lewis, would also soon be made aware of this. When he arrived at the estate on May 14th, things were in disarray. Lewis, who served as Washington's secretary between 1789 and 91, was chosen to escort his aunt and her grandchildren to New York, but was surprised and a bit concerned when he arrived to find a frenzied and hectic scene. Lewis wrote, "Everything appeared to be in confusion." The manifestation of Mrs. Washington's feelings. Lewis later went on to describe the departure on May 16th, 1789. He wrote, "After an early dinner and making all necessary arrangements, in which we were greatly retarded, it brought us to 3 o'clock in the afternoon when we left Mount V. The servants of the house and a number of the field negroes made their appearance to take leave of their mistress. Numbers of these poor wretches seemed greatly agitated, much affected. My aunt equally so." Betty, Ona Judge's mother, must have been one of those agitated slaves. Not only was she losing her 16-year-old daughter, but she was also losing her son, Austin, who would serve as one of the Washington's waiters. Austin's wife, Charlotte, and their children would have joined in the morning. Betty watched her children leave Mount Vernon, a reminder of what little control enslaved mothers had over the lives of their children. If she found any comfort that day, it would have been that brother and sister were traveling together. Austin was older and male and could look out for his younger sister, but still Betty knew that her relationship with her children would never be the same. And so there's this moment when it's not an auction block situation, but it's clearly a moment when Ona is taken from her family, her will, to New York, hundreds of miles away. Now, the stay in New York was relatively short. The nation's capital would switch a year later to Philadelphia. And I have an image here of what the president's house, this is a lithograph from the 1830s, so a little bit later. But I always, once again, like to show this image because, especially to my students, I want them to see what an 18th century president's house looks like. You know, it's not a White House or a Mar-a-Lago, wherever presidents live these days. You know, it's sort of in our sort of estimation, it's a modest home. For them, it was significant, but it was also quite full, quite packed. This was a house that had, when the Washingtons moved to Philadelphia, they actually decided to, so there were an additional 9 enslaved at different points in this house. Ona was one of them. They had the Washingtons, their 2 grandchildren that they adopted and brought to live in the house, a team of white servants, secretaries for the president, their families. So this house had upwards of close to 30 people living in this house in the 1790s. So it was packed, and privacy was at a minimum. But what's important about this moment that Ona and the others moved to Philadelphia is that it's the first time she's really center stage in contact with Black freedom. So New York, you know, there's a significant number of free people, but there are many more enslaved men and women. So when Ona comes to New York, it's sort of this middle ground. There's a lot of slaves, some free Black people. When she comes to Philadelphia, that totally changes. There was the largest percentage of free Blacks in the North were in Philadelphia. So slavery had just about ended in Philly. There were maybe 100 slaves. And there were thousands of free Black people. Washington sort of thinks that he's exempt. Basically, you know, this is a sort of incredible moment when you think about the Attorney General hold the law by enslaved people. You know, so it's this moment where you're like, you know, you kind of, I'm reading these letters, I'm like, right on, I'm glad y'all did that. And so he's going to the Washingtons like, you got a problem. Right. And you may want to fix this. So there's a set of letters that go back and forth between George Washington and his secretary, Tobias Lear. Tobias writes to him and asks, what should we do about the blacks in the family? They never use the word slaves. They always use the word servants, Negroes, never use the term slaves. In this case, Tobias is calling them the blacks in the family. So he writes this letter to George, and George responds. And he writes this letter and he says, what we're going to do is to create a slave rotation plan. And every 6 months, we'll rotate the slaves out of Philadelphia back to Mount Vernon. And if that's a problem, we can take a short trip to Trenton, New Jersey, across the river, and basically stop the clock, right, on freedom. And so, you know, I'm reading this letter, and there's a line in the letter that went something like, I wish to deceive them, meaning the slaves, and the public. And so, you know, as a historian looking through these letters, I'm like, George, what were you doing? Like, there are so many opportunities to use any other form of labor aside from slave labor, right? Right. And so not only was he committed to it, but he was also breaking the law, at least the spirit of the law, but actually there was an amendment passed later on that said you couldn't do what he was doing. So it also reminds us about thinking about presidential power and the abuse of the law. We see that with our first president, in this case of slavery and what was convenient or something that he desired. So for the next 6 years, Ona was rotated back and forth to Mount Vernon or a quick trip to Trenton. And this would go on for, as I said, 6 years. And so all during this time, though, Ona is in the kind of epicenter of Black freedom. So while she's in the oddball and an enslaved person, she's also able to witness Black freedom around her. Black men and women are selling pepper pot soup, they're running taverns and boarding homes. Mother Bethel AME is literally being built a stone's throw away from where the president's house stood, right? So here she is witnessing. Black freedom is palpable. And although the Washingtons did their very best to shield their slaves from those possibilities, it was impossible to do that. So I argue that she grows up in a moment as a teenager and a young adult with Black freedom all around her as something that she would have never experienced at Mount Vernon. It was the opposite. And so this is sort of what happens over the next 6 years until February of 1796. February, the Washingtons receive a letter. And they receive a letter from their granddaughter, and her name was Eliza Parke Custis Law. She's actually Martha Washington's granddaughter. So let me just be clear here. George and Martha Washington never had biological children together. George had no biological children that we know of, right? Martha was, as I said, married before, had children. All of her children died either very young and her last surviving son died during the Revolution from camp fever. So she really only had her grandchildren to love, to honor, to protect, and to care about. And that's why they actually adopt 2 of their grandchildren and bring them to live with them in New York and Philadelphia. Eliza was older and stayed in Virginia. But she visited Philadelphia frequently. And I always show this image. This was a portrait done by Gilbert Stuart, and because I want you to get a sort of feel for Eliza. And usually when I show this picture, people are like, you know, that's the sort of response, like, And so the folklore is that Eliza was known for being difficult and volcanic. And she was supposedly waiting. George Washington was having his portrait painted by Gilbert Stuart. And she was annoyed that it was taking really long, right? And so the rumor, the old folklore is that she burst into the room with her arms crossed. And Gilbert Stuart decided she was really interesting, so he decided he wanted to paint her too. So this is how the portrait develops. But I show this because this had a tremendous impact upon Ona's life. When she wrote home, or wrote to the Washingtons at their home in Philadelphia, she wrote to them and said, "I'm getting married, and you don't know him. And he's 20 years older than I am. And he's a British man. And he spent a lot of time in India, and he has 3 biracial Indian children." Like, this dude is a total wild card for the Washingtons. They don't know. It's kind of hit them from nowhere. And she's basically writing to them, asking for their approval. Her father's deceased. George Washington's the president. She writes to him, and George and Martha are upset. Martha more upset than George, and eventually they write back and say, "If this is truly what you want, then we will accept that." They don't go to the wedding, but they say, this is what we'll accept. Meanwhile, Martha is sort of thinking deeply about this, and she's worried that Eliza is not really prepared to be married, let alone to raise a family. And Martha Washington knew that she would be in Philadelphia for some time, not able to help her. So she would do the one thing that a good grandmother could do. She would give her the very best wedding gift, and that was Ona. And so Judge understood her mistress, and she knew just how much Martha Washington loved her grandchildren. And although Ona had been this sort of chosen enslaved person for Martha Washington, she knew she did not have enough capital, social, emotional, to sway Martha Washington on this decision. And so there are different moments, because Ona leaves behind testimony where she talks about her feelings with Eliza, and she says, "I was determined never to be her slave." And so there's this moment that Ona has to make a decision, and she makes a decision that she simply could not let this happen. Judge knew what the future held should she not heed the advice of her free Black associates. She supposed if she went back to Virginia, she would never have a chance to escape. Once she learned that, quote, upon the decease of her master and mistress, she would become the property of a granddaughter of theirs by the name of Custis, and, quote, she knew that she had to flee. She imagined that her work for the laws would begin immediately, not after the death of her owners, prompting a fierce clarity about the future and her dislike for Eliza Custis. As I said before, she was determined never to be her slave. Her decision was made. She would risk everything to avoid the clutches of the new Mrs. Law. Judge was well informed.